In a sudden and forceful move that blindsided Washington, Chad has slammed its doors shut to US citizens and halted all visa processing. But the real question is, why now? Why would a nation once seen as firmly within the West's sphere of influence take such a bold stance? Is this just a reaction to a long-held grievance, or are we witnessing the early tremors of a much larger rebellion sweeping through Africa? Let's dig deeper and find out. Chad remains silent, cooperative, and nearly unnoticeable on the international scene for decades. It hosted French military sites, supported US counterinsurgency activities, and accepted security assistance with lengthy, unwritten conditions, playing the loyal partner in innumerable Western-led operations throughout Africa. Although it wasn't a glamorous job, it was necessary for survival, but that quiet wasn't tranquility. Containment was the strategy. Resentment simmered underneath the handshakes and picture opportunities. The pattern of Western countries taking advantage of regional instability to defend long-term military sites was repeated in Chad. Rarely with full Chadian approval, foreign military operate, fly drones, and collect intelligence on Chadian territory. In the meantime, pledges of mutual respect, investment, and progress never came to pass. Chad was only another dot on the Sahel map to the majority of the globe. However, Chad served as a lever and a tool for Washington and Paris to maintain control over the area. Since Chad didn't resist, the illusion was successful. Sanctions were absorbed. It accepted reprimands in public. It continued to be strategically valuable until a single event altered everything. Around the beginning of 2025, Chad abruptly stopped issuing visas to Americans. It was not sweetened with diplomatic language, nor was it leaked or negotiated. It was quick, icy, and decisive. A declaration of finality. This wasn't only unexpected for a nation that is frequently portrayed as weak and reliant. It was groundbreaking. Doors were slammed shut without any preamble or courteous warnings. This seemed like a betrayal to Washington. However, it was the first sincere action in decades for Chad. It was a message as much as it was a trip. You cannot treat us as though we are expendable. In actuality, though, this was never solely about visas. It had nothing to do with embassy lines or tourism. It was the burial of an unequal relationship, a symbolic execution. The humiliation Chad had suffered under the pretense of cooperation was finally rejected. This was not anger. It was a plan. What caused it? Some point to Trump's reinstatement of the travel restriction from the United States, which previously included Chad on the list of nations with deficiencies. Others link it to years of covert slights and overt manipulation, particularly in relation to anti-insurgency operations and migration politics, which forced Chad to take chances in hopes of rewards that never materialized. However, policy did not cause the last snap. It resulted from insight. Other African countries, especially Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, had ripped down their colonial scaffolding and risen tall without it, while Chad had watched. They took over their resources, drove out French troops, and started rewriting the regulations. They also didn't fall apart. Everything altered as a result. A frightening question was posed by Chad's leadership, not to the West but to itself. What happens if we no longer require them? And the response comes quickly after you pose that question. Because what had previously been perceived as assistance, military presence, foreign aid, and intelligence cooperation started to resemble reliance, monitoring, occupation, and authority, disguising itself as protection. The visa restriction sliced through that illusion like a scalpel. Here's the twist, though. Isolation was not the source of this act of revolt. It was inspired. Chad wasn't running away into the darkness. It was getting ready to enter a new era, one that would be influenced by a new coalition of African resistance that was emerging just next door rather than by the West. Therefore, the prohibition on visas was just the beginning, because you're already facing a different path when you destroy a bridge. Where was Chad going then? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. A nation cannot afford to remain isolated for very long after shutting out a superpower. Isolation, unless intentional, is suicide in geopolitics. Furthermore, Chad's timing of defiance was not coincidental. Something extraordinary had already started to take shape just beyond its southern and western bounds. Formerly regarded as the cornerstones of Western influence in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had torn up their old manuals. They ejected the United States and France in addition to criticizing them. Hard exits, no ambiguous reforms, no sluggish transitions. The pro-West regional group was laughed off, French soldiers were shown the door, and embassies were frozen. Instead of chaos, cooperation arose from that emptiness. Within months, these three countries formed a historic new partnership called the Partnership of Sahel States, AES, a name that sounded more like destiny than desperation. An unrepentant military and economic alliance founded on African self-determination rather than outside direction. One that swore into brotherhood on all levels, militarily, economically, and ideologically, and swore against outside intervention. The writing was on the wall for Chad's president, Mohamed Idris Deby. He had witnessed Afghanistan's collapse. Like an empire losing its hold, he had witnessed France's influence evaporating from Francophone Africa. As the colonists torched French flags, he had heard the chants of Nigerian crowds shouting down with them. Most significantly, though, he had witnessed success, something far more perilous to the established quo. Despite dire predictions from the world's media, the AES was not just surviving but stabilizing. Their governments were still in place, their armed forces were combining, and their economy were restructuring independently of the IMF rather than collapsing. They were rising instead of sinking. Chad had previously feared this power vacuum, but it now saw an opportunity. Chad had long served as the West Sahel strategy's silent axis. It had a powerful military and close intelligence connections, but it was also weak. Too exposed to US counterinsurgency programs and too dependent on French logistics. Chad would either become irrelevant or surrounded by independents if the AES solidified its position. One logical route was the only one. Before the revolution passes you by, join the rebellion. However, avoiding strategic isolation wasn't the only goal here. It was intimate. Niger and Mali share borders, cultures, and areas of conflict with Chad. Foreign drones, like armed forces, don't stop at lines on a map. The AES encompassed more than just political principles. It was about surviving in a world when foreign powers target the countries they say they are protecting. By 2025, there was no denying the momentum. Burkina Faso and Mali were patrolling together. Both countries had bilateral defense agreements with Niger. To cut off the last remaining economic ties to France's treasury, plans for a single central bank, a unified currency, and even a joint energy system were discussed. Chad saw a shield instead of just neighbors when it gazed to the south and west. And Chad saw nothing but instability as it turned its gaze north toward Libya and the chaos beyond. The civil conflict in Sudan to the east. Nigeria, a country to the west, is unwilling to face its dependence and is heavily involved with Western banking. However, there was a reason for the new AES capital corridors to the southwest, which included Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. Chad also desired to join. However, the choice was more than just a pragmatic one. It was a generational issue. A fresh generation of African leaders was emerging. Yes, military guys became politicians, but they had a startling similarity. They had no desire to be controlled. They weren't requesting help. They were requesting deference. And they weren't using slogans to demand it. They were using structure. Chad didn't respond when he applied to join the AES. It was a development, logically following the rejection of foreign control. A bridge had been destroyed by the visa prohibition. The partnership now provided a road, and the West did not pave that path. However, it did pose a fresh query. What will happen to the Western security network that used to characterize the Sahel if Chad joins the AES and contributes to its expansion? Diplomacy isn't the answer. It has to do with dominance and the gradual breakdown of a Western chessboard that had been in place for decades. That's our next destination. Chad's tilt toward the Sahelian States alliance was more than a simple change of allegiance. It threw a wrench in a table that the West had been using for decades. The Sahel has long represented more than simply conflict and sand to Washington, Paris, Brussels, and even London. It has served as a strategic anchor point and a manageable corridor that links West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and most importantly, the vulnerable underbelly of Europe through migrant routes. What about Chad? One of the last dependable pieces on that board was Chad. So far, Chad's decision to defect and join the AES presents the West with a horrifying reality. It no longer dictates the direction of counterinsurgency efforts, the narrative of stability throughout the area, or the flow of intelligence. From Dakar to Djibouti, the once sturdy alliance network is disintegrating. Because of rejection, not because of war. Let's be clear. External conquest was not the cause of this decline. Internal erosion is the cause. Due to its refusal to accept its partners as equals, the West lost the Sahel. Western military involvement in Africa was marketed for years as a means of maintaining security and combating rebellion. To train, equip, and arm troops throughout the region, billions of dollars were spent. Thousands of soldiers were stationed during French Operation Barkhane. From facilities in Nigeria and Chad, the US conducted special forces operations, intelligence centers, and drone missions. NATO watched in silence. Human rights were given lip regard by the EU. But the game was obvious underlying it all. Control was implied by presence, command of the airspace, authority over resources, authority over choices. The problem was that the opponent continued to deteriorate. And the so-called partners kept asking, why are there more attacks if foreign troops are there to protect us? Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso were the first to call for clarification. They received none. They kicked down the door as a result. Chad observed, listened, calculated. Chad has now joined the AES, which has helped shift the scales rather than merely picking a side. Today, the AES encompasses a region that stretches from the west, close to the Atlantic, deep into Central Africa, and directly across the Sahel. It surpasses France in size. It shares borders with the Gulf of Guinea, Nigeria, Sudan, Algeria, and Libya. Furthermore, the partnership can no longer be written off as a rebellious experiment because of Chad's military might. It acts as a regional check on the dominance of the West. Additionally, the West loses eyes and ears in a region it once considered its own with every base closure and diplomatic snub. More significantly, the AES is not playing the same game. There are no G7 roundtables, IMF debt restructuring sessions, or World Bank requirements. Here, a self-governing ecosystem is being established, supported by alternative allies like China, Russia, Turkey, and even Iran, and financed by internal resource control. This is not a rerun of the Cold War. The past masters are being ignored. The obvious has already been acknowledged by France. Its policy in Sahel has failed. In the cities they used to police, French soldiers have been jeered. Western embassies no longer represent diplomacy, but rather dissatisfaction. Additionally, US influence, which was largely dependent on alliances with stable governments, is currently limited. Because popular military chiefs who no longer answer the phone when the Pentagon calls have overthrown the steady regimes. Chad plays an important part in this, as a fulcrum, not as a follower. Chad provides the AES with a key base upon which to grow because of its oil deposits, seasoned military, and Central African location. It links Africa's east and west. It provides airways that were previously on NATO's maps. The fact that this is more than just a military theater lends legitimacy to it. It's a fact of strategy. The West is presently in a panic. The dialogue has resumed. American ambassadors are providing guarantees. Envoys are being sent by European ministers. However, it's too late to resume normal operations. Because Chad didn't simply switch sides when he joined the AES, redrawing the map was aided by it. The ancient chessboard has been broken. The components are moving quickly, and a brand new game has started. The true question, though, is this: what comes next? Because can the AES replace the financial framework that Africa formerly relied on from the West if it transforms from a protective pack to an economic engine? It is possible to demolish military bases. It is possible to close embassies. Your freedom is an illusion, though, if someone else controls your currency. As the alliance of Sahel States started cutting their connections with the West, Chad and all of its members came to this realization. Because there was something more pervasive, more dangerous, and far more permanent than troops or trade embargoes underneath every drone strike and development agreement. The franc. In particular, the CFA franc, a colonial artifact that is still in use in several countries in West and Central Africa. The CFA has long been promoted as a sign of stability because it is issued from Paris, is under the jurisdiction of the French Treasury, and is linked to the euro. In actuality, it has been a leash that has allowed France, and consequently the West, to set monetary policy for vast regions of Africa. Even politically independent countries like Chad were unable to print money without European approval, borrow money without Western supervision, or develop without caving into the same organizations that call for structural changes, which are code for cutting budgets, privatizing public goods, and selling off state assets to foreign buyers. However, the restrictions are changing now that Chad has partnered with the AES. The partnership is more than just a security agreement. The insurgency is economic, and at the heart of that rebellion lies a daring ambition to establish its own banking system, something that no African bloc supported by the West has dared to do. What's on the table is this: a joint central bank that is not subject to French oversight. A new currency that is supported by African resources, managed by African institutions, and not bound to the euro. AES members cross-border trade agreements that do not require US currency or European banks. Agreements for energy sharing that let nations finance infrastructure without awaiting World Bank approval. Laws pertaining to resource nationalization also guarantee that rare earths, oil, uranium, and gold end up in local treasuries rather than overseas safes. This is not an abstract dream for Chad. It's the most obvious route to self-respect. While its citizens continued to rely on foreign loans, Chad has seen its oil wealth leave the country over the years. Free market principles, which were never intended for them, have caused domestic industries to wither while Western corporations have made billions. And the same creditors appeared with contracts rather than answers whenever a crisis struck, be it inflation, drought, or war. Chad now has the opportunity to end the cycle as the AES economic model gains traction. The first step is to recover value, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of what wealth means in Africa. The West ruled what was valuable for far too long. Investor confidence, GDP goals, cash reserves, and credit scores. However, that model is being reversed by the AES. Sovereignty is synonymous with money in this partnership. Unless locals say differently, gold remains in the earth. Food that is consumed by your people before being exported for financial gain. Africans created the roads, railroads, and refineries, not to boost the stock price of others. Chad is not renouncing modernity by switching to this system. The goal is to create a modernity that doesn't need consent from previous colonizers. A prototype currency system amongst AES members is already being discussed. It may be supported by both resource-backed tokens and gold reserves. It's dangerous, radical, and unproven. It's real though. Furthermore, this pledge is free of terms that undermine national sovereignty, in contrast to those offered by the World Bank or IMF. The economists in the West are in a panic. They're afraid it might work, not because they believe it will fail. The AES sets a standard for the rest of Africa if it creates a self-sustaining economic engine, with Chad playing a significant role. That begging for loans is not necessary. That you can balance your books without hiring outside consultants. Because building a future does not require colonial money, and is the true danger to the dominance of the West. If a landlocked and often overlooked nation like Chad can take part in building a new African financial system from scratch, then what excuse do the others have? But every revolution brings resistance, and this one is no different. As Chad and the alliance of Sahel States move toward a post-CFA future, the pressure is already building. Sabotage, media attacks, and economic sanctions are likely just around the corner. The real question is, can Chad weather the storm it helped unleash? And what if that storm isn't temporary? What if it becomes the new normal? Will the struggle be worth it? Share your thoughts in the comments below.